The heavy oak doors of the Dirksen Senate office building do not just separate a hallway from a room, they mark the threshold between the secular street and a sacred chamber. Inside the hearing room of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the air is not merely stale with bureaucracy, it is thick with the weight of unseen rituals. We are not witnessing a job interview today, we are witnessing a trial of faith. The nominee sitting at the witness table, Amer Ghalib, the mayor of Hamtramck, Michigan, adjusts his microphone. The silence that precedes the first question is profound, reminiscent of the hush before a sermon. But the men and women looking down from the dais are not just senators. In this moment, they function as the high priests of the American civil religion, and they have detected a heresy. When we speak of religion in the halls of government, we often think of prayer breakfasts or sworn oaths on Bibles, but the sociologist Robert Bellah described a deeper, more pervasive force, the civil religion of the state itself. It has its own saints, its own scriptures, and, crucially, its own dogmas. Nowhere is this dogma more rigid than in the confirmation of a diplomat. To be an ambassador is to be an apostle of the state, sent forth to spread its gospel. And when Amer Ghalib, a Muslim immigrant who rose to political prominence in a city known for its piety, sits before this committee, the questions he faces are not technical inquiries about visa protocols or trade tariffs, they are catechisms. Listen closely to the interrogation regarding his past social media posts. The senators recite specific statements he has made about the Middle East, about Israel, about the nature of power in the region. They demand he recant. This is the modern equivalent of the medieval Inquisition asking a scholar to renounce a forbidden text. The orthodoxy here is the bipartisan consensus on the U.S.-Israel relationship, a pillar of American foreign policy so central it functions like a theological tenet. To question it, or to have questioned it in the digital past, is to commit blasphemy against the established order. Ghalib finds himself in a labyrinth. If he stands fully by his past words, his personal truth, his scripture, he is deemed unfit for the priesthood of diplomacy. If he recants too easily, he is seen as a charlatan. The tension in the room is palpable because it is the friction of two competing moral universes grinding against one another. The Senate is enforcing a ritual of confirmation, a rite of passage where the initiate must demonstrate total submission to the state's narrative. When Ghalib hesitates, offering context or nuance, it is treated not as diplomatic caution, but as spiritual resistance. The committee is not just checking his background, they are inspecting his soul for doctrinal purity. They need to know if the man from Hamtramck belongs to himself or if he has fully converted to the religion of the State Department. In this hallowed chamber, there is no room for dual allegiances. The gavel, when it finally falls, will sound less like a bureaucratic punctuation and more like a final judgment on who is allowed to carry the sacred chalice of American power abroad. In the quiet, dust-mote-filled archives of the State Department, there hangs a portrait of the ideal diplomat. It is an image not of a person, but of a vessel, a blank slate, a tabula rasa. The myth tells us that when an envoy dons the suit and takes the oath, they shed their personal history, their private gods, and their individual conscience to become a pure instrument of national interest. It is a priestly vow of celibacy, but of the mind. The ambassador is expected to be a mirror, reflecting only the official policy of Washington, never the stirrings of their own heart. But as we watch Amer Ghalib struggle under the glare of the Senate lights, we see the cracks in this porcelain mask. The myth of neutrality is crumbling. History is littered with envoys who found this vestment too tight to wear. We might recall the early Protestant missionaries turned diplomats who struggled to separate their evangelism from their dispatches, or the Cold War emissaries who found their personal ethics at war with the ruthless pragmatism of containment. The Foreign Service has always functioned like a secular priesthood, with unwritten rules of conduct that go far beyond the employee handbook. One of these rules is the suppression of identity when it conflicts with the mission. Yet the paradox of the Ghalib nomination is that his identity is precisely why he is there. The administration selected him because he is a Muslim, because he speaks the language of the faithful in a region where faith is the currency of trust. They want the aesthetic of his identity, the cultural bridge, the handshake that feels authentic in a Kuwaiti diwan. They want the mystic's connection. But the magisterium, the institutional authority of the foreign policy establishment, fears the reality of that identity. They want a Muslim ambassador who can quote the Quran to charm a host, but who will instantly pivot to the secular catechism of American hegemony when the door closes. It is a demand for a profound psychological splitting. This is the ancient tension between the mystic and the church, played out in the theater of international relations. The mystic seeks direct experience and personal truth. The church demands order and hierarchy. Ghalib represents the messy, complex reality of lived religion, faith that informs politics, community loyalties that span borders. The Senate represents the rigid structure of the state, which views any loyalty outside itself as a threat. The hesitation we see in Ghalib, the careful parsing of words, is the struggle of a man trying to serve two masters in a system that insists there is only one God, the national interest. The state wants to harvest the fruit of his background without tasting the soil it grew in. They want his Muslimness to be a costume he can take off, not a skin he lives in. And as we look back at the long line of envoys sent to the Muslim world, we see that Washington has always been more comfortable with the costume than the man. The sun sets over the Potomac, casting long, jagged shadows across the monuments of the Capitol. It is a time of transition, a twilight of the idols. The nomination of Amer Ghalib by Donald Trump is not merely a scaffing decision, it is an act of iconoclasm. In the religious history of empires, the iconoclast is the one who smashes the sacred images to clear the way for a new order. By choosing a mayor from Michigan, a man whose path to power lay through the grassroots mosques and community centers of the Rust Belt rather than the Ivy League corridors of Georgetown, the administration has taken a hammer to the stained glass of diplomatic decorum. We must understand this through the lens of transaction and transformation. The civil religion of the old guard relied on a high priesthood of experts, men and women groomed in the seminaries of foreign service schools, fluent in the liturgy of liberal internationalism. Trump's move prioritizes a different kind of faith, transactional loyalty. The votes of Hamtramck were the offering, and this ambassadorship is the blessing bestowed in return. To the traditionalist of the State Department, this is sacrilege. It profanes the sacred mystery of diplomacy by making it explicitly, brutally political. But to the iconoclast, the old rituals have lost their power. They are empty ceremonies that no longer command the reverence of the faithful. This disruption forces us to confront an uncomfortable ethical question, one that lingers long after the Senate hearing concludes. Can true interfaith diplomacy exist if the diplomat is forced to renounce their personal scripture to serve the state? If Amer Ghalib must sanitize his past, edit his beliefs, and perform the ritual of confirmation perfectly to be accepted, then is he really an ambassador of his community or just an ambassador from it? The promise of a pluralistic empire is that it can contain multitudes, that a man can be fully Muslim and fully American, fully critical and fully loyal. But the spectacle of 2025 suggests that the American empire is jealous. It demands a monotheism of allegiance. The conflict over this nomination is a signal that the boundaries of the civil religion are being tested as never before. We are watching a collision between the diverse, chaotic reality of the American populace and the frozen, unitary dogma of the American state. Whether Ghalib goes to Kuwait or stays in Michigan, the temple has been disturbed. The worshippers are looking around, realizing that the old gods may not be listening, and the new ones demand a different kind of sacrifice. The ritual is broken, and in the silence that follows, we can hear the sound of the world rearranging itself.